Last time we left Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow on top of the world, or at least on top of the charts. Long Live Rock and Roll had given the band their biggest commercial moment yet. The lineup felt locked in, the future looked bright, and then Ritchie Blackmore, being Ritchie Blackmore, decided to blow it all up. I've covered that story already, as well as the follow-up, Down to Earth, but here's what we haven't covered: what happened next for the man standing in the wreckage. Because when Ronnie James Dio walked out of Rainbow in 1979, he wasn't just leaving a band, he was leaving behind the only real shot at stardom he'd ever had. He'd built his reputation note by note through years with Elf and then Rainbow, and now, at 37 years old, he was starting from scratch. No band, no record deal, no clear path forward. But here's the thing about Ronnie James Dio. The universe had a habit of dropping the right door in front of him at exactly the right moment. And somewhere across Los Angeles, that door was already opening, because while Dio was figuring out his next move, there was another band completely falling apart, one that had been the biggest name in heavy metal for nearly a decade, Black Sabbath. By 1979, Black Sabbath was a disaster. Not artistically, they never stopped being capable of great music, but personally, internally, chemically, they were a mess. After the Never Say Die tour wrapped, the band convened in Los Angeles, renting a house in Bel Air, and spent 11 months trying to write a follow-up album. Now, that's a long time, 11 months, and almost nothing usable came out of it. The problem, in large part, was Ozzy. Tony Iommi described the process as highly frustrating and never-ending. Ozzy Osbourne had lost the plot. By his own admission, deep in the fog of substance abuse, unable to engage creatively, checked out in a way that was slowly strangling the band. Ozzy himself has said he'd grown tired of the experimental direction the band had taken with Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, and he wanted to go back to something heavier, something rawer. But frustrating irony was that even knowing what he didn't want, he couldn't figure out what he did want. Eventually, Tony Iommi has had enough. He sent his best friend, drummer Bill Ward, to deliver the news Ozzy Osbourne was fired from Black Sabbath. To the outside world, that was basically the end. You don't replace the voice of Black Sabbath. You don't replace the guy who sang Paranoid, Iron Man, War Pigs. The whole identity of that band was wrapped up in Ozzy's personality. That wild energy, that chaos, the unpredictability. Without him, what was Black Sabbath? But Tony Iommi was determined to find out. The introduction happened through one of rock history's great ironies. Sharon Arden, daughter of Don Arden, the band's manager, and the woman who would eventually marry Ozzy Osbourne himself, introduced Tony Iommi to Ronnie James Dio in 1979. Think about that for a second. The future Mrs. Osbourne is the one who handed her future husband's replacement directly to his old band. At first, the meeting was exploratory. Iommi and Dio talked about maybe forming something entirely new, a fresh project with no baggage. But then fate stepped in again. The two men ran into each other by chance at a bar called The Rainbow, not the band, the famous Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, and something clicked. Dio later recalled it simply: "It must have been fate because we connected so instantly." They kept in touch. Eventually, Dio showed up at Iommi's Los Angeles house for what was described as a relaxed, low-key jam session. Just two guys seeing if the music worked. And on that very first day, they finished a song together, a piece Iommi had been sitting on for a while, abandoned during the chaotic Ozzy sessions. That song was Children of the Sea. One afternoon, done, and that's how naturally it came. Of course, nothing about this period was actually clean or simple. Black Sabbath's lineup was in chaos beyond just the Ozzy situation. Bassist Geezer Butler, the band's primary lyricist for a decade, the man behind some of heavy metal's most iconic words, was going through a divorce, and his future with the band was genuinely uncertain. Demo recordings from this period feature keyboard player Jeff Nichols on bass, not Butler, At one point, Dio was actually pulling double duty, singing and playing bass, a skill he picked up years earlier in Elf. Iommi even called his friend Frank Zappa looking for a bassist. Zappa offered his own player. Iommi said no, he needed someone permanent. And Bill Ward was barely present. He had been battling severe alcoholism for years, and by the point it was consuming him, Iommi has written that Ward has no memory of the period in which the album was recorded. Zero, none at all. And during the recording sessions, Iommi, in a prank that went catastrophically wrong, set Bill Ward on fire. Literally, he doused him with a solution used to clean tape heads and ignited it, not realizing how flammable it was. Ward suffered third-degree burns, and he still carries the scars. These were not exactly ideal conditions for making a classic album. Eventually, Geezer Butler came back. Jeff Nichols stayed on as an unofficial keyboardist. The band stabilized enough to move forward, and Dio brought something special with him from his Rainbow days, a recommendation for a producer, Martin Birch, the same Martin Birch who had engineered and produced Rainbow's finest work. Birch was exactly what Black Sabbath needed, a serious professional who understood heavy rock and could impose some discipline on a band that had been running without external guidance since 1971. He was the first outside producer to work with Sabbath since Roger Bain on Master of Reality nearly a decade later. They recorded the album at Criteria Studios in Miami, the same studio where Sabbath had made Technical Ecstasy, and also at Studios Ferber in Paris. And what Iommi discovered in the studio with Dio was something that fundamentally changed how he thought about songwriting. He put it plainly in his memoir. With Ozzy, the vocals followed the riff. Ozzy was singing the guitar melody, tracking it closely, nothing wrong with that. Iron Man proves the power of that approach, but Dio sang across the riff. He found a completely different melodic line that sat on top of the music rather than mirroring it. For Tony Iommi, that opened doors he didn't even know were closed. The album that came out of this was Heaven and Hell, released April 25th, 1980. And it opens with a statement of intent. Neon Nights kicks the door open from the first note. Fast, bright, aggressive, melodically sharp, in a way that classic Sabbath rarely was. It announced immediately that this was not going to be an Ozzy era nostalgia trip. This was something new. Children of the Sea, the song born in that first afternoon in Iommi's house, is the album's emotional heart. It's epic and cinematic, building slowly before opening up into something genuinely beautiful. You can hear two people who trust each other completely. Lady Evil is the album's most straightforward rocker, tight, hooky, built for radio, even if radio wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. Then comes the title track itself, Heaven and Hell, 7 minutes of heavy metal theater. This is where Dio's lyrical world, his preoccupation with duality, with light and dark, with moral choice, framed in a language of mythology and fantasy, takes full form inside a Sabbath context. The lyrics are entirely Dio's. Geezer Butler, the band lyricist for a decade, step back and lets the new voice take over. The result is a completely different philosophical lens on what Black Sabbath could be about. Wishing Well and Walk Away fill out the middle of the record. Solid, propulsive, less celebrated, but part of the album's coherent whole. Die Young becomes one of the era's defining singles, another example of the new Sabbath energy, bright and driving and memorable. And then the album closes on Lonely Is the Word, a slow, grinding, blues-drenched piece that, interestingly, was Bill Ward's favorite track on the whole record. He said it felt real in a way that some of the other material didn't. Maybe that tells you something about where Ward's head was during all of this. The album came out in a remarkable year for heavy metal, 1980. That was when AC/DC released Back in Black, when Motorhead put out Ace of Spades, Iron Maiden, self-titled debut, Judas Priest released British Steel. The new wave of British heavy metal was in full swing, and somehow in the middle of that, the band everyone had written off walked back with a record that didn't just survive, it thrived. Heaven and Hell hit number 1 in the UK and number 28 in the US. It eventually went platinum in America. Some Some fans had hated it when Dio stepped in front of a crowd that had spent a decade watching Ozzy in the spot. Some of them screamed for Ozzy by name, but gradually the music won them over. The tour, though, would bring its own crisis. Bill Ward, already barely holding on, reached a breaking point on the road. The story goes that Dio entered his hotel phone one morning mid-tour to hear Ward say almost casually, "I'm off then, Ron." Then Dio asked where he's going. Ward replied, "No, I'm off, mate. I'm at the airport now." He was gone. Black Sabbath were forced to cancel their sold-out show at McNichols Sports Arena in Denver, although Blue the Cult performed and received the sizable proceeds. Ward's personal struggles, which included the deaths of both of his parents during that period, had simply overwhelmed him. He was replaced quickly by a young American drummer named Vinny Appice. That Dio era of Black Sabbath had arrived, and it was already evolving, shaping, dealing with new pressures, new creative possibilities. The band that made Heaven and Hell wasn't entirely the same band that would enter the studio next time, because next time they would make Mob Rules. That's a story for another video. In the meantime, check out the Deep Purple playlist. This is the first video where Black Sabbath is entering Deep Purple's world, and they will continue to be in the Deep Purple world for the next 3 albums. So I'll be covering those, and I also cover Whitesnake and Gillan, the Ian Gillan Band, Rainbow, and Deep Purple. So all that in the playlist. Like, subscribe. See you in the next one.